This is Belgrade, the capital of Belgrade, a very nice city in Serbia, where I also went a few years ago to look at South Asians. Go to the next slide. This is Jelena Čevorović, who is a social anthropologist there, and I teamed up with her, and we've been collecting some data on, if you go to the next slide, these people. These are South Asians, the Gypsies, the Roma as they're now called. And there are a lot of them in Serbia and Eastern Europe. In fact, we have two members of the European Parliament with us here in the audience, and I think they'll probably vouchsafe for the view that the Roma, the Gypsies, are now a major social problem in large parts of Western Europe because they're coming from the Eastern Europe into Italy and Britain and France, and they are a social dislocating force, crime and so on. And it's been very well known that the Roma have a very poor educational level, and there are a few studies showing that they have a very low IQ. And people always wonder why is this true? But if you go back to my original chart, the IQ map of the world, they are a South Asian population. The average IQ there is 85, and so you would expect these people to have social problems. Okay, if you go to the next slide. These are, again, this is a gypsy girl. The living conditions are very bad. If you go to the next slide, the communities look like almost rubbish tips. And once again, you could say, well, yes, if you're being raised in a condition like this, you're going to have a very low educational level and intelligence. On the other hand, if you start off with a very low intelligence and educational level, you're going to have, if you have a very low intelligence, you're going to have a poor educational level, and you're going to create conditions like this. If you go to the next slide, this is the easiest Raven's progressive matrices items or puzzles that you can get. These are for children. You can just look at a glance. You don't even have to use a lot of logic to figure out which is the correct answer. You can just look at a glance and see which is the correct answer. We used this particular test because the Roma were complaining that the previous test that we'd given even to black Africans gave them a headache. They just couldn't do it. But even this test for children gave them a headache. So the particular group of gypsies we looked at had an incredibly low IQ. It was down to about 70. Whereas most studies of gypsies show that they have an average IQ of 85. And we actually think that what happened is that a lot of the more intelligent Roma from places like Serbia, the former Yugoslavia, have already gone to places like Germany. And they were, in fact, telling us that they have relatives in Germany and so on, and they have jobs there or on welfare there. The pickings, so to speak, are just so much better in Western Europe now that they can move there than in Eastern Europe. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Good, okay. So the question is, are these worldwide IQ differences genetic or cultural in origin? And there's several lines of evidence that we put forward to show that it's genetic. And I'll go very, very briefly through them, but there's one that I'm going to focus in on. And the first one is the worldwide consistency of the scores. If you buy into a cultural perspective, you would expect that when you change the culture in which you live, or magnify the environmental opportunities, you're going to change the IQ scores around. And in fact, you do not. What we find is that there's a consistency to these IQ scores over 80 different years of testing and a variety of different conditions. So, for example, the South Asians who have moved into, say, Holland, have now, North Africans, Moroccans, and so on, are now in the second generation. And they've gone through the school system there, the nutritional system there, and they speak Dutch fluently, and yet their IQ is only up to about 89. In other words, yes, they've gone from 85 to 89 in one generation, and that's about the kind of level of improvement that you might expect under a genetic hypothesis. You might get 3 or 4 points due to the culture, because nobody's saying it's 100% genetic. It's at least 50% genetic, maybe as high as 60 or 80% genetic. So there's some movement due to culture, but the genes keep the culture on a leash. It may be a relatively moderately long leash, but there's a leash, and eventually you can't go any higher up. So that's the first argument for it being genetic. Maybe that's not a very strong argument. Let's go to the next slide. I'll skip over this basically because this is basically the race differences are most pronounced on the most G-loaded components of tests. And the G-loaded component is that component which is the most predictive part. As it gets a bit technical, there's no point in belaboring it. Let's move to the next one, because this is the one I want to spend time on. The race differences are most pronounced on the most heritable components of the tests. And that's where I'm now going to get a little bit more technical. Go to the next slide. We've just published a paper in July of last year in the Proceedings of the Royal Society of London. And this is a very prestigious journal. I'm saying this not so much to toot my own horn as to convey the view that these studies are now in the scientific mainstream. They're now being accepted by the mainstream biology journals, which probably would never have happened 10 years ago. Now, they have not percolated up into the mainstream media. The New York Times or even The Economist is not going to run with this. But among academics, if I go to a scientific conference where I've just presented these papers about 2 months ago, the people will listen to it and take it on board, and they recognize that there's some truth there, a lot of truth there. So this is now very, very acceptable kinds of data. We, in fact, in that paper that I've just mentioned, published 2 samples. We had 2 twin studies. And it's the second study that I'm going to tell you about the most. If you go to the next slide, it's probably more understandable. This, again, is one of the puzzles, and there are 60 of them, from the Raven's progressive matrices. And there are twins who have done these puzzles. The most famous twin study in the world is the study of the Minnesota study of twins raised apart. So these were children who were separated at infancy. They were raised unknown to each other for maybe 30 or 40 years in different families. They grew up, they were then reunited by the research team and brought to the University of Minnesota, where they were then examined to see how similar they are. Even though they've been separated for 40 years, how similar do they end up being? And we all know they're very similar. And the question for me, because I had access to these data from Tom Bouchard at the University of Minnesota, was how similar are they on the various puzzles? So on some of these puzzles, the twins who've never met each other before are more similar to each other than on other puzzles. And the more similar they are to each other, the more genetically influenced it therefore must be the answers to that puzzle. And by the same token, since they are identical twins, genetically identical, any differences between them must be due to the culture or environments that they were raised in. So how different are they on each of these different puzzles? And so that was our origin of our study. How heritable, how similar were the identical twins raised apart, because that's the measure of heritability, and how different were they, because that's the measure of environmentality. Okay, if we go to the next slide.